What's going on, guys? We're back, and we've got something different this time around. I want to talk about one of the biggest questions that I've noticed recently, not only in the media, in the comment sections of these videos, other videos, kind of all over, is how is Ukraine turning the tide? We haven't seen this massive breakthrough on the front line where Ukraine's taking all this land like they did in Kursk in 2024. Um, we're not seeing anything like that. There have been incremental gains on the front line in certain areas like Konstantinivka and down more like southeastern areas, but nothing massive. So why is it kind of widespread and everybody's talking about the fact that Ukraine's turning the tide of the war? And I've been able to break that down to about three main topics that I want to talk to you guys about, share some statistics, some stuff that I've researched and learned along the way. Okay. So to start, please like, share, subscribe. I want to try to do more of these educational style videos and bring more value in the way of educating on the situation here in Ukraine and in the war in general. I love doing the reactions, watching Russians explode. That's everybody loves that, love that. But I want to implement some of this information as well because I do have I this is my life here in Ukraine, right? So I spend a lot of time researching, reading, watching all kinds of stuff, and then double checking different statistics and analyses, and kind of making sure to get the real information rather than what Fox News is saying or CNN is saying or something like that, right? So I want to share this information. So I want to start with this isn't one of the three big factors for Ukraine turning the tide of the war. This is kind of a side note, but we'll start with it. Um, and that is the help from Western allies. Okay, the reason this isn't one of the big three, in my opinion, is because since the new administration, or since the most recent administration, Donald Trump and his administration, the United States have taken office in 2025, early 2025, all United States aid has ceased. So I've got a graph here, and you can see the difference between European aid and U.S. aid over since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. But we can bring it down to 2025 when Trump took office. From the beginning of 2025, all aid stopped to Ukraine from the United States of America. This makes my blood boil and unbelievably angry, but I'm going to try to not get too emotional about that and save that for another video. Okay, so we'll see in Q1, quarter one of 2025, quarter two, quarter three, and quarter four of 2025. Big fat goose egg, roughly, of aid to Ukraine from the United States. Huge travesty. But the EU, European allies, have stepped it up a lot. And that was more or less, I think, what Donald Trump explains his goal was for pulling aid. At least that's what he claims, right? And to his defense, in that sense, it's worked. It's made Europe step up and help more. But that's not a reason to completely cut aid, especially for as long as the United States has. Maybe if that's the route they wanted to go, in my opinion, the US could have cut aid for a couple of months. And as we can see in this graph here, the EU stepped up 10 billion in Q1, 14 billion in Q2, and then it started to kind of wean off. 5 billion in Q3, back up a little bit to 8 billion in quarter four. And I don't have the 2026 statistics, but I do know just by doing my own research, the United States has given zero aid to Ukraine still. So just don't know how much the EU has contributed, but based off what I've been learning, it's been a decent amount. So I wanted that to kind of be a, an idea for people to understand. I see a lot of comments and kind of this misconception that the US is still helping Ukraine. No, they're not. They could be in the way of intelligence sharing. Maybe the CIA is involved. I'm sure they are in some kind of capacity, right? But as far as actual aid converted to dollar amounts, right? And I'm not referring to like a blank check that the US would sign to Ukraine. I'm referring to more of how they were doing it previously. The US was doing it previously, which was offloading some of these vehicles and weapons that the United States was no longer using. And it actually would cost the United States to decommission a lot of this equipment. So instead, they were sending it to Ukraine, and all of that equipment, that weaponry, that ammunition was then translated into dollar amounts. So that's where we see a lot of the money um, that Ukraine was sending, or that the U.S. was sending to Ukraine, plus some fat checks too. Let's be clear. There was also some very large checks that made it to where they needed to be, and I think a lot of it didn't because of some of the corruption that's happening in Ukraine. There's no, I don't want to hide or beat around the bush regarding that. There's definitely corruption in Ukraine. I think it's safe to say there's corruption in probably every single country. I think one of the largest contributors to corruption in the world is actually the United States at the moment, just with what we're kind of seeing play out with some of the large corporations, these megacorps, some of the insider trading that we see, blah, blah, blah. So the United States they don't have their hands washed completely of corruption either, right? So I just want to make sure that's clear. It's not like Ukraine's the only corrupt nation and we can't send them money because they're corrupt. No, there is a problem of corruption in Ukraine. That's not a reason to completely stop sending aid. And what we saw at the beginning of March of this year, 2026, is the United States entered a war, conflict, whatever, Operation Epic Fury with Iran, with United States ally Israel. When this happened, oil prices shot through the roof because they locked up the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC, which is the tyrannical regime running Iran, they locked up the Strait of Hormuz, and it shot a lot of the world's oil comes through that Strait of Hormuz. Not United States' oil necessarily, but a lot of Europe's, a lot of the Eastern world countries. So oil rose, and from basically what happened is in order to ease the pressure of global oil prices that are skyrocketing because of this war that the United States started, Trump decided, or the United States decided to release some of the sanctions. They provided what are called waivers to release some of the sanctions off of Russia that have been in place for a long time now. To basically allow Russia to start selling their oil that they've had, kind of stockpiling, in order to decrease the global price of oil and release some of that pressure off of the United States administration, so they don't look like this terrible bad guy who has made it more expensive for everybody to live because oil prices have gone up. That is such a snaky thing to do. It's basically saying, okay, Ukraine's an ally of the United States, Israel's an ally of the United States. Who's more important? They're putting Israel way up here on a pedestal and saying, Ukraine, you can go away. Not only did they completely cut funding and all aid to Ukraine, but now they're going to allow the United States are going to allow Russia to start making a lot of money again with these sanction waivers on the Russian oil. So I was able to do some research and find a general rough number of how much Russia has made from March to current day, because we just keep extending these waivers. These sanction waivers were supposed to be 30 days from March. And then we extended that into April, another 30 days. Now we extended that into May, another 30 days. And now we extended that again into July. And the rough number that I've been able to find on multiple different sources is 19 to 22 billion dollars that Russia has made offloading some of this previously sanctioned oil. And this money, we can only assume a large portion of this is going towards the Russian war machine and their efforts to occupy more of Ukraine, basically. So That's disgusting to me. That's really frustrating, but that's something that needed to be talked about. Now, let's jump into the three main reasons Ukraine is actually winning and starting to win and starting to turn the tide of the battle. Number one is just the sheer amount of casualties that Russia has taken. Now, there's tons of different numbers online, but through multiple resources, it looks like people are these different organizations and um, statistics are kind of starting to agree upon a general number, which is 1.2 million, roughly 1.2 million Russian casualties. That means KIA, killed in action, that means wounded, and that means missing. Um, Now, of that 100 or 1.2 million um, soldiers, it's roughly kind of agreed upon that about 350,000 of those are confirmed Russian killed in action. Confirmed dead Russian soldiers, 350,000. Now that's a low estimate in my opinion because of the sheer amount that are missing. That's probably, if they were to take into consideration all of the people that are missing that are actually dead, that number would skyrocket. Okay, but so again, the rough number, 1.2 million casualties, killed, missing, and wounded, and 350,000 more or less confirmed killed. That's massive. Number one, that's not sustainable. And number two, this is the largest loss of soldiers and personnel in Russian history since World War II, and it's very quickly gaining on the World War II numbers. Not only has this war in Ukraine lasted longer than World War II at this point, but now the numbers are starting to creep up to the amount that Russia lost, which was an ungodly amount in World War II, fighting against the Nazis. And so I did look at the Ukrainian government's numbers, and they're different but similar. So Ukraine says 1.4 million casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. So zero point 0.2, so 200,000 more than what these other organizations and groups are claiming. And then they also broke down some of the other numbers as far some more specific metrics. So the Ukrainian government says Russia has lost 12,000 tanks. These are rough numbers. Some of them I rounded up, some of them I rounded down, depending on how close they were. 12,000 tanks. This is since the beginning of the full scale invasion. 25,000 armored vehicles. We're talking about APCs, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, things like that. 436 aircraft, and that is specifically referring to bombers, fighters, recon aircraft, stuff like that, not drones, and 353 helicopters. So helicopters are their own category of aircraft, 353 helicopters. Now, this is all directly from Ukraine's government, these numbers. So keep in mind there could be a bias, there could be, it could sway a little bit more in Ukraine's favor, these numbers, but those are the rough numbers that they give. So that's number one. One reason that Ukraine is turning the tide is because the casualties are not sustainable anymore. And before, when we, like in 2022 up to 2025, really, Russia was taking a lot of casualties, not as much as 2026, but they were taking a lot of casualties, but they were able to replenish these numbers in their recruitment efforts, and it was a net gain. So they were able to replenish the amount of soldiers they were losing. And on top of that, they were still gaining an overall amount of soldiers. So, for example, if they lost 20,000 soldiers in a month, Russia was recruiting 35,000. So, if we cancel out the 20,000, then they have a net gain of 15,000 Russian soldiers who have been added to the Russian Federation personnel numbers. That's no longer the case. Now we're seeing the Russian casualties. For example, last month it said that, from what I can tell through different resources, Russia lost between 30 to 35,000 soldiers last month. In 1 month, 30 to 35,000, and they recruited 20 to 25,000. So that's a net loss an overall loss of 5 to 10,000 soldiers. So that means instead of going like this in their recruitment numbers, or even like a more shallow like this, it's actively now declining. They are losing more than they're gaining. So we're starting to see that become. That's why we're starting to see this part of the reason we're starting to see this tide shift in Ukraine's favor. That's point number one. Point number two, and potentially the most important of the three, is Ukraine's drone revolution, if you will, the drone renaissance. Um, Ukraine and Russia basically pioneered drone warfare when this um, war started. They were kind of leapfrogging each other in drone tech and implementation on the battlefield. So what I mean is Ukraine would kind of have the upper hand for a couple of months, where they came up with a new way to use drones, build drones, use a different material, use a different ordnance, whatever, and it became very effective. And then Russia caught on and then improved on it, and now Russia was taking the lead in the drone war. And then boom, boom, we kind of saw this leapfrog strategy for kind of more or less from 2022, the beginning of the full scale invasion, to 2025. 2026 kicked off, and there was this, instead of doing this leapfrogging, Ukraine jumped way up here and kind of left Russia in the dirt. Now, Russia still launches thousands of drones into Ukraine every single month, sometimes multiple thousand in one day. But the actual technology and effectiveness of these drones is what we're seeing Ukraine take the lead in. And so, to give a more exact example, there used to be a trade off in drone warfare, in the sense that if you had a drone that was carrying a really big bomb, right, it could only fly very short distances because it was heavy. So if it was more dangerous, more explosives were loaded onto it, it had to fly less, right? There was a trade-off. And then if it flew really far, you had to put a smaller amount of explosives on it, right? It makes sense. Ukraine has figured out how to bridge this gap and put a lot of explosives on a drone that flies really, really far. And so what we've seen is this. Not only have we seen a lot more effective long range drone strikes all the way into Moscow, past Moscow, into these different drone manufacturing facilities, oil refineries, things like that, but also what seems. What's up, Charlie? Come here, Bubba. What seems to be the biggest factor of the changes on the battlefield are these mid range drone strike campaigns. So what I mean by that is, instead of fighting in the immediate, what I would consider to be what they call a kill zone, which is like 20, really it's more like 20 to 50 kilometers from the front line. That's where it's always been dangerous, very dangerous, and it's increasing, right? But now Ukraine is able to take these drones and fly them longer distances, not super far, but we're talking multiple hundreds of kilometers. And so what we're seeing now is Ukraine is able to reach deeper into the occupied territory, occupied Ukraine, and into Russia proper, and start hitting these logistics and supply centers that are, once there's pressure on these logistics and the supply centers, it causes major issues for the soldiers on the front fighting. Um, so, for example, there is a part of Crimea, well, all of Crimea, and then there is what they call a land bridge. And I'll put a visual aid up here. A land bridge, which is basically one road or two roads that link Crimea up to Russia proper, and up into like Donetsk City and Mariupol, which are major logistics hubs for Russia. Ukraine has been able to more or less sever this land bridge. So we're starting to see people in southern occupied Ukraine become very desperate, not getting resources, not getting resupplied. The logistics and supply chains cannot reach them anymore. Same with Crimea. Because this land bridge has been severed, Crimea is becoming exponentially more desperate because they can't receive supplies. So these middle range strike campaigns are starting to hit be able to reach these logistics and supply hubs to make the situation on the front lines extremely desperate for these Russian soldiers. So that, again, in my opinion, is probably the biggest factor of the change, at least on the battlefield that we see. So that was two, the drone revolution, the drone renaissance that Ukraine is now objectively winning. It's not an opinion. Like Ukraine is ahead for sure. And why is that? I think Ukraine's became much more self-reliant on their own drone industry now. For example, the United States last year was able to produce about, from what I could tell, about 300,000 drones of different kinds. This year is projected Ukraine to make 5.5 million drones. Okay, so we're talking exponential differences here. This is a massive industry in Ukraine. Plus, there are now European countries who are starting to set up or have been setting up these big drone manufacturing facilities, this big drone production, and they're starting to send drones to Ukraine as well. So just the sheer amount of drones that Ukraine has gotten over this past year has been a lot more. Okay, so first was the amount of casualties, second was the drone revolution, and then third is the economy. And the economy is something we touched on a little bit at the beginning, but more specifically, because of this mid-range strike ability and long-range strike ability that Ukraine has been much more effective at, they've been able to really hurt Russia's oil industry. Russia is a one resource economy, oil. They have been the largest supplier of oil, if not one of the largest suppliers of oil, um, for decades, right? And Ukraine knows that. It's typically against the Geneva Convention to start hitting um, economic infrastructure like that, but you don't play by the Geneva Convention when you're fighting terrorists, frankly. And that's what Russia is. Russia's been breaking these rules and committing war crimes since day one of the full scale invasion in February of 2022. Really, before that, back in 2014, when they invaded Donbass and took Crimea. Anyways, so these mid-range strike campaigns and long-range strike campaigns have been decimating a lot of massive Russian oil refineries and hurting the Russian oil industry. So one reason we're seeing it take such a toll on Russia is because, number one, the Ukrainians' capacity and ability with drones has become a lot more effective, like we discussed in the second reason. But also, Ukraine is targeting specific infrastructure that is really difficult for Russia to repair or get replacements of. So Russia has a lot of Western technology, Western nation technology that they use in their oil refineries, their oil production, their oil infrastructure. And when takes out these systems and this machinery that was supplied from the West to Russia, when Ukraine takes this out, Russia can't just be like, hey, England, we need more of these parts. Hey, US, we need more of these parts. They can't do that anymore. So it's not an easy fix. They can't slap a band-aid on it and just continue to produce oil. It's not working. Now, with that said, Russia has such a large oil industry that I don't even think it would be fair to say that Ukraine has crippled it yet, but it has definitely damaged it. What I mean by that is they are still producing so much oil, and Russia and Iran and North Korea are still buying so much oil from Russia that it's not a category 5 disaster for Russia yet, but it has definitely hurt them, and it has caused Russia to increase their price per barrel of oil, which is how oil is sold. It's increased Russia to increase this to make up for the amount of oil they're losing and to fix their oil industry. So when they raise these prices, it's forcing Iran, China, North Korea and other nations that are still buying Russian oil to buy it at a more expensive rate, right? Which means ideally, or theoretically, they would buy less because it's more expensive. So, but it's a massive industry. They still make so much money on it. And like I said, it's not crippled yet, but it's damaged and it's getting continuously damaged more and more and more, right? Exponentially. So, this overall economic pressure on Russia um, is another is the third reason why we're starting to see this change on the battlefield. This tide shifting in Ukraine's favor. When you put all of those together, I wouldn't say one of those singly would do it, but when you put all of these together, it it creates a more broad picture of why we're starting to see this drastic change of power and this more dynamic switch up of from that we've seen in previous years. Ukraine has always been on their back foot since the beginning of the full scale invasion. Ukraine has just been fighting for their lives, literally their land, their family, and retreating and fighting and retreating and fighting and retreating. And now the line has been stabilized for a pretty long period of time, and Ukraine is more on the offensive. Not, like I said at the beginning, not necessarily taking a bunch of land back, because I don't even think that would be the most effective use of the Ukrainian military, right? If Ukraine goes and takes back a bunch of land, now they're spreading all their resources out and their limited resources out, and it could become a problem, right? So they've stabilized the line, and now they're striking deeper to make a more significant impact on Russia as a whole, right? We're starting to see the Russian public opinion of Vladimir Putin drop very drastically. Russians are now being affected by the war. Before, people in Moscow, people in St. Petersburg, they don't care, dude. They go about their business. Prices haven't changed. Nobody that they know is dying because Russia's just recruited from all the outskirts villages and stuff like that. They're not getting drone striked. They're not getting hit by ballistic missiles. Nobody cared. Now that's changed. The sheer amount of losses, the amount of everybody knows somebody that's been influenced by the war now in Ukraine and in Russia. And now we're starting to see all these videos pop up online and social media of Russians doing what the Ukrainians have been doing for years, and now they're videoing drones flying over their hometowns and smashing into their cities. Right now, they're starting to get affected. Now they're starting to have to pay a little bit more for oil and gas, and when they're at the pumps filling up their cars, we've seen countless videos of these massive lines in these different Russian cities and towns, these massive lines of cars all trying to get oil because there's oil shortages in certain regions. People are starting to get affected now. And now that they're starting to get affected, now they're starting to get interested in what's going on. And they're wondering, okay, what are we doing? Why are we doing this again? Why have we've been attacking them again? Now they're starting to care, right? All right. That is all I got, you guys. Let me know if if you found any value in this type of video. If not, you can let me know that too. But I appreciate you guys. I love you, and we'll see you in the next video.